like to introduce David Rickless, who works for the Center for Disease Control. He is a UGA alum, so we're happy to see the success running through our geography department. So without further ado, I'll just go ahead and hand it over to him. So welcome, David.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
All right. I don't know how long we'll be working from home before we'll be able to start meetings without saying that, but I still feel like I have to check. Yeah, so really happy to be here, see some familiar faces and familiar names, so good to see you guys. Wish it could be in person, but you guys have done a great job putting this together, so glad we're able to do it. Okay, you should be seeing my title slide now. So Austin, can you just confirm that?
Yep.
Cool, thank you. All right. So I think I know some of you that are here, but just to be official, my name's David Rickless. I am a GIS analyst supporting the Geospatial program at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta. And that program is called the Geospatial Research Analysis and Services Program, also known as GRASP. The government is a big fan of their acronyms, so I've been there a couple years now, and I still don't know all the acronyms. They also just changed a lot of them, so that's how that goes. I actually work for a contracting company called Perspecta, so I'm supposed to specify that I'm not a federal employee, but day-to-day functionality is pretty much the same. So this program GRASP, I'm going to talk sort of broadly about geospatial work that is done at the CDC and the history of it, because a lot of times people are surprised that the CDC hires geographers, and they're surprised that there is such an interest in geography and maps and spatial analysis within the public health community. And I think it seems like a natural pairing for a lot of people with a geography background, that those things would go together. But for a lot of folks, they're like, oh, what do? You just map diseases? And so I'm going to start by talking about where geography and GIS fits in to the work we do, and where it might be going in the future at the CDC. And then I'm going to talk more specifically about the program that I work in that does not all of, but a lot of the geospatial work that CDC takes on. And so that program, GRASP, is housed within an agency called the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, and ATSDR is the acronym for that. And I'm mentioning that just because some of these slides use those terms interchangeably, and it's basically a much smaller sort of related agency to the CDC with a lot of the same leadership. And it's important for things I'm going to talk about later, because ATSDR was actually created as an environmental health agency. It was created because of a pretty small section of the Superfund Act, or CERCLA. And basically, it was created originally to go to places, to communities where there was a environmental health concern. And those might be places that the EPA was working on, or those might be places that the community actually went to the government asking for them to come in. And the idea of ATSDR was to be the public health counterpart to the EPA's remediation work. So ATSDR doesn't do regulatory stuff. They don't do remediation. It's in like the physical engineering stuff. But what they do is they go and look at the public health impact of whatever event, whether it was a chemical release or a facility like a factory of some kind that was causing toxic emissions. And so they were created to do that. And that is still a lot of the work they do. And so we fall within that work, but we also do a lot of other things. So talking about that just for context, And so now I want to take sort of a big step back and look at the history of GIS at the CDC to sort of see where we came from and where we are now and where we might go in the future. There we go. So in the early days of using GIS at the CDC, a lot of the focus was on producing maps to show the relationship between hazards and populations. And the most important question that they were asking and answering was, where are things taking place? And of course, that's, very central question to geography. Very reasonable that that would be the case. I actually think, going back even further, I always like to bring up the John Snow cholera maps in London. I forget what decade of the 19th century that was. And I think that if you don't know, it's the story is that John Snow was able to locate the source of a cholera epidemic in the time before they really understood how those things spread, by mapping the wells or water pumps, I guess, that people were getting water from, and mapping where the diseases were. And he found an association there. And there's a little more nuance to it, but for our purposes, that's the gist of it. And I just think that's really cool because it is a sort of foundational story that's claimed by GIS, as in a story of how GIS can be useful to society. But it's also a foundational story of epidemiology because they're interested in tracing, the source of where an outbreak comes from. And so there's a very long-running understanding of maps being central to that, to seeing where things are. Now, going a little more into the present, they've started asking questions about what and why, showing more interest in using GIS to quantify and characterize the linkages between exposures and outcomes. So a little more quantitative, I would say. For those of you who are geographers, I think perhaps this is sort of me editorializing, but perhaps it could be compared to the quantitative turn in geography, where it moved from sort of descriptive work to more scientific method, proving things work. And this happened later in this scenario, but I think kind of similar. So examples are connecting air dispersion plumes, where pollutants might be spreading into the air to cancer at a specific zip code level, using statistics, space-time cluster modeling to identify cancer clusters, and using maps and interactive tools to try to sort of communicate the relationships between industry and contaminants and potentially affected communities. And these online maps are very, very popular and have been used. I've worked on some. That's a lot of my time goes into those. They're used, interestingly, on both sides of a study, because a lot of these studies that the agency is doing are eventually distributed to the public. They're doing it to help a community understand its risk. And so I see the environmental health scientists that are doing the analysis use geographic information systems that we create for them to do their analysis, and then in turn also using it to communicate their results to the community members. And so I think it falls on the side of analysis, and it also falls on the side of communication and education. And so I think that speaks to the versatility of maps and map-based applications more generally. Now, where it's going in the future, and I think I should note these slides were originally used by some agency leadership to sort of talk about GIS at a high level. And so I think it's very important and interesting to note the integration. Integration, I think, is the key word here. There's a lot of interest in making GIS a central part of decision making and capacity building, importantly, which capacity building is what the government calls teaching. I've found I hadn't heard that term before starting here, but and I think it's a very important aspect of what we do, and something that's worth thinking about for those of us that are sort of early in a career in geography and GIS, that you know, there is a lot of interest in learning how to use those tools, and generally making GIS a central part of building it into the way that the government does business, so to speak. So that's the vision of where GIS could be going in the CDC. And so I wanted to show that mainly to communicate that it does have a pretty substantial history, and also that from what I see, there's a lot of interest in continuing to do work with it. So good news if you are a geographer that's interested in public health. So now I want to talk a bit about the Geospatial Research Analysis and Services Program, or GRASP. And that is where geospatial work happens at CDC or ATSDR. And I think it could be described as a hub of geospatial work. It also has a fairly long history. It began originally in 1989 with just a handful of people. I think that was probably a really fun time. It was a lot of geographers that, you know, made maps, and it honestly, for those of you that are, I assume most of you are in the UGA geography department, it makes me think a little bit of CGR, just that it was like a collection of people who were really excited about, you know, GIS technology and adjacent things working together. At least, I mean, I wasn't there, obviously, at least from what I've seen of their old pictures, which they have a lot. So that's cool, but it's become a lot more formalized and a lot larger over time. So now there's a staff of 60 people, which includes geographers, analysts, statisticians, epidemiologists, web developers, communications people, project managers. And as you can see, this is the official mission statement that they have. It's very broad, includes much of the work that the agency does, and also the work with state partners where they're engaging with exposure investigations and public health studies. So underlying a lot of the mission statement and the work that this group does is this concept that we call place and health. And it's I think, a carefully chosen phrasing that underlies our work, and I think is illustrative of the direction that geospatial public health work is going. And there is so it's important to think here about you know, how maybe different fields perceive spatial data and geography and place and health. And I know place has a very specific place and space have very specific meanings in geography. So we're not talking about Lefebvre here. Actually, we're just talking about space and place in more casual sense. And that's something that I think the public health world is, of course, aware of, but it isn't quite as integrated into public health practice. And so GRASP is interested, I mean, almost all of the work that we do is very applied and very, you know, practical. However, I do see a lot of interest in sort of contributing to this thinking about place and health, which I think is cool. And there is an idea in public health that's pretty widely accepted these days called social determinants of health, which is what you know, I might call social vulnerability. Basically, the idea that health is determined by socioeconomic factors, and things like that, not just genetics, not just, you know, and not just individual choices. So it's an idea that should seem familiar to a lot of geographers. And so we're sort of working within that widely accepted framework and proposing the idea of geospatial determinants of health. And you know, as a geographer, that probably seems like a minor distinction there, but it's an interesting thing to see going forward in the government. The idea that the places of our lives, homes, workplaces, schools, parks, etc., affect the quality of our health and influence our experience with disease and well-being. And I'm actually, these are some notes that I copied from this public-facing website that they have describing place and health as a framework that articulates the many and varied geospatial drivers that influence disease prevalence and promote health. It's at work at multiple environments where we experience health, including the natural environment, built environment, population, social and behavioral environment, and the health policy environment. And the emerging purpose of geospatial determinants of health is to define the geospatial drivers of health with an emphasis on factors that vary by place, serve as a catalyst to define, promote, and advance the use of place in research and practice across the public health community, and to shape the public health curriculum of schools across the US to advance GIS statistics and technology in the study of health. And so I mentioned that as an example of where work in the public health world that focuses on geography and GIS is headed. And I think it should sound pretty familiar. Again, if you have a background in GIS and geography, but that is the guiding principle that this organization is trying to advance. And in fact, we organize a conference every year called Place and Health, and it's for the purpose of, you know, advancing these ideas. So again, takeaway from that is if you're a researcher that's interested in GIS techniques and public health or healthcare, or if you're, you know, a student or recent grad interested in moving in that direction, I think there's a lot of opportunity. I think it's it can feel when you're in the GIS world, especially in a geography department, it can feel like it's sort of taken for granted. Like, of course it has a map, you know, of course they're thinking about space, but that is a unique way of thinking that we learn studying these topics, and I think there's a good place for it in public health. So moving on though, outside to move sort of beyond the sort of abstract stuff, I'd like to talk a bit about the type of work that is done specifically in GRASP, in the CDC Geospatial program. And there's a lot of work done. It's a lot of projects. Everyone is juggling many projects. It's a little bit like graduate school at times, but they all fall into several different categories, which are built into their organization. So analysis and training and capacity building is a big one, and that's where I spend most of my time. This group applies geospatial methods and tools to support public health practice. We develop and deliver trainings for CDC staff and other public health people in the community. We do a lot of work on environmental health studies that I was talking about earlier. So that's where most of your general GIS analysis falls, and there's a lot of variety there. GIS technology includes, in this case, online mapping and interactive maps, GIS applications, and platforms for sharing geospatial data. So that's where our web developers work, our IT project managers, our database developers. So a lot of important tasks there. They've had a lot of work from the COVID-19 response. Geospatial epidemiology research has its own group, although there's a lot of overlap with the others. And this is mainly focused on applied research and developing and sharing new geospatial methods for epidemiology. And then another group focuses on public health emergencies. And so I also do some work in that group supporting CDC's Emergency Operations Center, which is a very interesting organization, lots of fast-paced work. Within that, we support disease outbreaks like Ebola, polio, cholera, and of course, COVID, and acute chemical exposures and natural disasters. And that group, of course, has also gotten a lot of work recently. So this is a high-level overview of the topics and the types of work that take place within the CDC's geospatial group as reflected by our organization. But I do want to talk also, and this will be sort of my last but also largest section of the talk, is some specific examples of the work that we do in the geospatial group. So I'm going to share some basic examples from each of the sort of units that I talked about. The first is within the analysis and mapping group, environmental health exposure assessment. So I mentioned at the beginning, this is a lot of the work that ATSDR does. And it's working with, it's site-based work with state and local health officials with the goal of protecting communities from health effects associated with exposure to hazardous contaminants. And I think these are really cool, mainly because it's a unique thing that happens within the government, and it's especially unique because the community can petition and request them themselves. So if a community is concerned about a hazardous contamination, then they can, there's a process where they can go to ATSDR and they can say, hey, we would like to have someone look at the health impacts and whether we should be concerned. There's a lot of, maybe they think they have higher cancer rates or something, and they want to, know if they should be drinking the water. This happens fairly often, and I think I've been years ago on the advocacy side of some of those issues. And so I've seen how much work it is to get some recourse if you're in that situation. And so I think it's a very cool thing that they do have, obviously there's, differences in terms of resources and access to, the means to learn how to do these petitions. But the idea that this process exists, I think is cool. And so that's one way it can happen. If the EPA is working on a site, they can ask for ATSDR to look at the health impact. And basically, we do the public health assessments to identify whether a more in-depth health study of the population is needed or whether there's some other action that's warranted. And geography is a really central part of these assessments. Hazardous exposures happen, in the context of communities. And so the population interactions with the environment vary from place to place. So the geographic relationships are something that is thought of throughout. And as I touched on earlier, how the geospatial technology is used throughout this process. So it's used at the beginning to characterize the areas that could be contaminated and the populations that could be affected. And then it's used by the health scientists to analyze and display the spatial and temporal features and trends and any relationships. And then once they have their results, it's used to communicate these ideas and concepts to the public. And so we tend to come in to varying degrees at all of those steps. As a quick example here, this is the Coldwater Creek site in, it is in near St. Louis. It's a situation where radioactive waste materials from the extraction of uranium ore were deposited in and around this creek. The metal materials were originally stored at the St. Louis airport site. And waste piles were uncovered and particles washed into nearby properties, eventually contaminating the creek sediment where it flowed downstream. And without getting into all the details of the assessment, which I actually don't know because I didn't work on it, this was a while ago, the way that GIS was used was to basically say, well, the exposure across this entire area is not necessarily the same. And so dividing it into different sections in order to break out the analysis in each section was one step. And they also thought about particular areas where a person might have regular exposure. So you might not be able to say that a person would go to the exact spot every time they go to hang out by the creek, but they could go to the same area in general regularly. And so thinking about spaces that people conduct their everyday lives in, as well as the locations where exposure might occur. And they also used some statistical techniques to identify hotspots of high concentration values in their environmental sampling. And this is, a pretty, straightforward GIS analysis, I would say. It probably wasn't straightforward at the time they were doing it, but it's not something that is a super novel idea, but I think it's a good example of how GIS tasks that we learn are able to be used in these very real situations. So the next subset of work that I'd like to talk about is the applied research unit within the geospatial program at the CDC. And the example I'd like to share for this is the CDC Social Vulnerability Index. And this is something that isn't strictly part of the research program, but it grew out of the research program. It was designed by people in GRASP. And social vulnerability, of course, refers to this is the definition that we have on our website, refers to the potential negative effects on communities caused by external stresses on human health, including natural or human-caused disasters or disease outbreaks. Reducing social vulnerability can decrease both human suffering and economic loss. So that's a nice, simple definition. There are, of course, many. I would say it's the relative ability of a community to recover from a natural disaster compared to others and their sensitivity to it. Very big concept in social sciences and the study of natural hazards. This is actually the focus of my thesis at UGA. So it was very cool to move into a group that is working on similar topics. The CDC SVI uses a set of 15 census variables, and the intention specifically is to help local officials identify communities that may need support before, during, and after disasters. So it's specifically geared toward emergency response and emergency preparedness. One way that it differs from other similar products is that it's a really simple method by which the index is produced. And I won't go into the methods, but it's something that can be replicated without a deep knowledge of statistics. And so it's pretty approachable, and as a result has gotten a good bit of attention. It does include some research that I've done, including research since I started working at the CDC. We have a paper coming out, whenever the journal sends us the proof copy, maybe sometime this year, although it's looking less likely, but we have a paper coming out that's looking at the social vulnerability as it relates to where vulnerable populations received medical treatment during Hurricane Harvey in Texas. And so there's some interesting work being done with that. I think it's interesting. I've included a couple of references here. These are the original papers that were produced by GRASP introducing the CDC SBI. So the last thing I want to talk about in this overview of the geospatial units in CDC is the Emergency Response Unit and the GIS Technology Unit. And these, I'm showing one example for both of these because there's a lot of overlap currently between them. Emergency response covers very wide-reaching things, which if folks are interested in that, I'm happy to go into more detail about either of these units and the type of work that they do. But the biggest project by far right now is the COVID-19 response. And so we support that largely through data analytics and visualization. And one of the first ways that we became involved with this was this idea of creating a public-facing interactive dashboard that would show a map, that would show charts, it would show, well, basically it came about after the Johns Hopkins dashboard showing coronavirus all over the world became popular, and the CDC was like, hey, we need one of those, don't we? So they because of the extra rigor that goes into putting things out from the government, it took them a little longer, but we got it together. So I actually have not worked directly on this in a while, but I did work on it at the beginning in March. That was just as the response to COVID-19 was gearing up in the US, and we were still in the office. We were asked to put together an interactive map application for public consumption using basically the data that was available already online. And they asked for it, I believe, on a Tuesday or Wednesday and needed it by the end of the week. And so I have a very distinct memory of the group of us that were asked to work on that. As a little aside, the CDC campus that I work on is located on Buford Highway, which many of you may know is like the center of international food in Atlanta. And so we went next door and got Vietnamese, and we got Vietnamese coffee, got very caffeinated, and then we went back to the office and we spent 10 hours in a conference room, just working on these ArcGIS dashboard applications. Kind of unthinkable now, a bunch of people in a conference room all day. But at the time it was fine. And that became the prototype for what we now call COVID Data Tracker. And so it moved, once it sort of outgrew ArcGIS, and it moved to our internal web development team and became more fully integrated with the COVID response. So it's now receiving daily case counts live. And so I want to talk just a bit about this, then I'm gonna click through it. The front end is intentionally pretty simple and straightforward. I have some screenshots here where you can see the map and some charts, some different visualizations. But I think it's a very good example of where I think GIS could be going. So the data comes from a lot of different sources. There's a full extract, transform, load process that goes on behind the scenes to pull these, to pull live data that is, well, live, I say live, it's updated every day. Data that comes from official reports by states. That's sent in various formats to a group in the CDC that aggregates it and cleans it and stores it in databases. And then there is, of course, the visualization aspect that feeds it to the public website. And we were doing part of this update process by hand for a while. Every day somebody had to log on and double check that all the numbers were right and before putting it out there, because when the CDC puts out the wrong numbers, well, I don't know that they ever put out the wrong numbers. When they put out numbers that are different from what people expect, that can have consequences. I think they avoided that for the most part. And then we have various visualizations. So I'm going to try, and you guys let me know if this messes up the screen sharing. I'm going to try to click through it a bit here as an example. So you should be seeing my web browser now. And we have the map. This is a pretty straightforward interactive map, but a lot of thought went into it that is not necessarily obvious when you see it at the front. We have various options here. It's a little bit morbid. It's a little weird looking at these numbers every day, but it's become kind of part of the deal. We have trends over time. And I think the developers did a really good job of making these charts pretty user-friendly. And I'm not going to show everything here, but I do want to also show the forecasting map, or forecasting chart, which I think is interesting. This is using a combination of different models. So if you know your COVID-19 models, you can pick your preferred one or do the ensemble. And it shows projections and actual deaths or cases over time. And then there are some other maps. For example, we have testing results. And this gets a lot of views, so I think it's been considered a success. And it's available for the public, so if you find it useful, check it out. And my purpose in showing that to a large extent is just a few takeaways is that I see, the organization that I'm most familiar with right now adopting increasingly what I might call a spatial first mindset. So this, obviously, coronavirus is maybe a uniquely spatial phenomenon, but it was one of the first things on their mind when they were wanting to have a dashboard, wanting to show it to the public, not just us, but obviously Johns Hopkins, which made the one of the first ones. It's a mindset where the geographic patterns are considered from the get-go, not just analysis after the fact. And I think that is an interesting development and something that's interesting to think about for folks who are doing academic research is how do we get in front of a trend toward thinking about things, geospatial aspects of our work first, as opposed to analyzing things that have already happened. So maybe a whole discussion there. Another thing is a trend toward the integration of GIS with other technologies. So in this case, the web development is a big aspect of it, and also the data aggregation and cleaning processes that are part of the data science workflow. Those are a big part of it too. And then finally, to take it back to a less in the weeds thought, I think it's really a interesting example of how powerful maps remain as a tool for communication, but also just as an object of human fascination. Even this thing that is horrifying, that keeps us up at night and causes untold anxiety and suffering, we are still drawn to a map of it. We still want to know, where is it in space? Where is it? What are the relationships? And yes, people have high expectations about about transparency and about the way data are presented. And so there's a lot of criticism directed at maps. And we were talking about this earlier today on the panel, how it's even when maps are produced by a high profile entity and they're critiqued, even if that critique is roasting them on Reddit, it is still an interesting example of how people are interacting with maps and becoming aware of them and seeing the relationship to their immediate needs in their everyday life. And so if anything, it tells us that what we're doing is connecting with people and is important to them. And I think that's a pretty cool thing to wrap up with that thought. So I'm gonna end there, but I'm happy to hang around for a minute if there's for a few minutes if there's any questions.
David, that was awesome. What a great way to show how the CDC utilizes GIS. I think that was pretty encapsulating, and then leaving it on a note that's so prevalent in everyone's lifestyle right now. I just had a quick question. Kind of generally speaking, what has been like your favorite project to work on? What is like, yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
That's kind of a hard one because I've worked on a lot of different projects over the last couple of years. I do still have an attachment to the research work that I've been doing. That isn't, most of my job is not research, but it's cool to when I get a chance to do it. So we've done some, I really am really proud of the work that we've done as the social vulnerability team with Hurricane Harvey. And I'm also doing some work related to social vulnerability currently with a Office of the Department of Health and Human Services that's interested in looking at the effects of the sort of disparate effects of COVID on minority populations. So in terms of what I'm currently working on, probably that one, because I have sort of a hand in every step of the process of gathering the data through publishing the dashboard. So that's probably that one, and in general the ones where I'm either doing research or working on these other technologies projects.
There's a question here from Jerry Shannon, and I'm just going to read it. He says, have you seen ways that CDC is trying to build trust with the public given all the policies around COVID and case count? There's so much disrupt of government data at this point.
First of all, hey Jerry, good to hear from you. I think that's an interesting question. I think it's probably like at the forefront of what the folks working on the response are thinking. I've seen a little bit of the data that comes in being messy in various ways, frankly, as all data is. And so I think there's a lot of challenges there in terms of like building trust specifically. And I realize that there is a lot of distrust. I think in terms of building it specifically, I think that the people working on that are mainly focused on being very, very careful and very cautious. And it sometimes, this is me editorializing. I'm not speaking for them, but it comes down on the side of looking like they are not moving fast enough sometimes, perhaps, but they are being very careful to think a lot about what type of data they're presenting and what they're doing to it, how it's being cleaned and whatnot. So that's probably a lot of it. I don't know a lot at like the higher level that's going on, but definitely at the level of like individual like analysts and scientists, it's very much just like sort of nose to the grindstone. There's just a lot of work to be done getting things working, and that takes up a lot of their time, I think. So that's kind of a non-answer, but I guess the answer is they're being very very careful with what they say. There's a lot of knowing there's a lot of scrutiny, but there's not like a super direct interface with the public, so makes it a bit challenging to like really directly build that trust at this point, I think. Trying to find my Zoom screen.
And David, I really appreciate showing us more about CDC and what they do besides COVID. I think right now the focus on CDC is that it's only concentrating on COVID, but there's so much more that you've shared with us that that is going on. From your experience just working with COVID, what kind of public response do you feel you receive personally, just being associated?
I mean, it's a positive response. People are like, think it's you know, a good thing. I try to sort of I try to sort of direct it more toward like, okay, the people you need to be appreciative of are like the folks that are working around the clock on the response to, on the COVID response to, like, you know, get the data flows working and you know, work on health guidances. I'm sort of there to hopefully make their job a little bit easier. But it's a positive response. You know, I definitely hear people say that there's, you know, as Jerry mentioned, like some distrust of data from the government, and you know, that's often tied up with people's political views. So there's a whole other complication there, but generally positive.
Great. And we have a comment from Dr. Madden, and I'm going to read it because she has also shared a, actually, can we unmute Dr. Madden? It looks like she has a lot to say here.
Oh, sorry. Hi, David.
Hey.
No, I just, you know, because you mentioned John Snow's mapping project, and that is just such a seminal work in epidemiology. I just Googled it and put in the link real quick. So, and that was before there was germ theory. So he didn't even know why. He just saw the pattern of the outbreak, and they all seem to be getting their water from this one particular pump. So they took the handle off. So, and I've also heard some of that is legend, but anyway, there's some nice old maps at that link. But I did have a question about, you know, you personally in your work, do you get to work with international disease outbreaks? And in the future, would you be able to travel to those places?
Yeah, theoretically, yes. The emergency response group that sort of handles those does travel a lot. Obviously pre-COVID, several people with some good Delta status in the group. I haven't done any international travel yet, but just because it depends what projects you're on. But you know, I was doing a lot of domestic travel, or scheduled to this year for trainings and stuff, which was pretty cool. But yeah, I haven't, but it's done. We do some travel.
Great. Do you work with Ryan Lash?
Ryan Lash. That name sounds familiar, but I'm not directly.
So he's a Georgia graduate, and he worked at, I was his major advisor, and he's been with CDC for a while. I just don't know what, you know, which division, but he helped with the Yellow Book, doing a lot of that mapping and moving that Yellow Book online. But he's a great resource, you know, if you do, I know it's a big place, but if you ever get to see him, you know, you could say you have a Georgia connection.
Cool. Yeah, I could get on the Skype search and try to track him down.
Yeah. Great. Well, good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too.
And Jerry just put a comment in also. The book, The Ghost Map, is a good retelling of the snow map. Oh, I'll have to check that out. I didn't know about it.
Great. Well, it looks like we have a couple more minutes if anyone has any lingering questions, but, you know, really wanted to say thank you, David, for spending your evening with us and giving us all this insight for what the CDC does outside of COVID. Because I know right now that's pretty much on everyone's mind. It's just COVID, but I mean, there is so much more research and applications that go on, you know, when there's not a global pandemic that still does result in some very important things to know. So thank you so much for going over all of that with us. And so actually, just quick question, does all of the GIS unit operate out of Atlanta?
Nominally, yeah, I think there's some people who are, because we're working remotely, they're not physically in Atlanta, but that is where it's that's where it's based. Yeah, when we're in the office.
Cool.
But yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's this has been fun. I like doing these things, and it's it works pretty well virtually. So yeah, and hope it was somewhat interesting. I'm happy to. I actually didn't show my last slide. I forgot to pull that up, but you have my email address if anyone has any questions. I'm not going to share my screen again, but happy to talk more. I know people are looking for jobs sometimes. We do hire recent grads on a fairly regular basis. So not constantly, but regularly. So definitely hit me up. Would love to hook up some UGA folks.
So would you recommend people contact you directly, or do you have a just go to the website advice?
For like jobs, yeah, contact me, because the entry level jobs are fellowships, and sometimes they're publicized and sometimes they're not.
Oh, great. So
So,
everybody, you have a person on the inside, so take advantage of that.
yeah, I'm not making the decisions, but
Oh, I know.
I can tell you what's going on. So
Yeah, exactly.
Well, we can share your contact information with everyone who registered for the event, since we have all of their emails. So that'll be an easy way to get people connected with you. We can follow up with everyone doing that. Well, great. This was awesome, David. Thanks so much again for joining us. Happy GIS Day, everyone. We will be picking up things again tomorrow. Let me pull up the schedule real quick. I have a million tabs open, but I believe we start tomorrow at 2 p.m. We'll be highlighting women in GIS. So it'll be a good time to see some professors who teach GIS here at UGA, as well as some students, and get to share their experiences in the GIS field. So that'll be great. And then we're also going to be highlighting our students. We have 3 student presentations, and then followed by a talk by NASA Develop. And then we'll be concluding our GIS Day celebrations. So again, thanks, David, and hopefully we'll see everyone tomorrow.